I love playing amplified music, all except for the little part of my job that's doing this, troubleshooting. When you're playing an acoustic violin, you open it up, you take it out of the case, you play it, it works 99.999% of the time. Electronic gear is maybe, it's a lower number than that. So we're going to have some thought processes about what are we going to do when the stuff like isn't working, right? So the bad news and the good news is it happens to everybody. So it's not personal. Your gear doesn't hate you. It doesn't, stuff sometimes doesn't work. So what happens when you're ready to play? You plugged in, everything's powered up, and it's not working. What do I do now? Well, it would be helpful to have some strategies for problem solving so that we can get it fixed and we can spend our time playing music and making money rather than jacking around with gear, right? So we don't want to assume anything. That's one strategy. Another thing is to check everything and then have a systematic approach so that you're not sort of stabbing around in the dark just guessing. We're going to start at one end and work toward the other, right? So let's talk about all those steps. Don't assume. We don't want to assume that everything's working. You guys all know what assume means, right? So we're going to ask two questions. For the thing that I think I know, do I really know that thing? And how do I know that thing? I know my violin's working. Do I really though? And how do I know my violin is working? If I can't answer those questions, well, okay, I need to check. So, example, do I have power? I plugged in. I mean, the thing's, the light's on the thing and, should have power. But do I really have power? And how do I know I have power? Yes, I know the strip is lit up, but do you know that the outlet that you plugged into is working? So you got to check these things. Well, I plugged it into the strip. So maybe you need to plug that, unplug your pedal board and plug something else into that particular outlet. Oh, it didn't come on either. But do I know that the second thing works? So I'm going to go around and plug into different stuff and make sure that maybe it is just that outlet. So you don't want to assume anything. And, things got power. Does it really though? How do I know? So we got to check. The other thing about power's kind of goofy. And low voltage is really it's a much bigger problem on a gig than high voltage. In the US, we're running 110, 120. If we're running in the 90s because we got too many subwoofers pulling on this, or maybe somebody's got an ice cream machine plugged into the same circuit or whatever, low voltage can make things look like they're on. Your unit might power up, but it's going to act weird. Digital electronics really do not like low voltage. So again, they'll turn on, but they're not going to act right. And that's the same situation that we get with low batteries in active electronics. We get tons of calls from people, hey, I bought a violin from you guys and it was working great. And then it started kind of making weird sounds and then it quit working. Have you changed the battery? Battery? Yeah, some violins have batteries. And the same thing for LED lights. We actually get that question every now and then. Hey, my LED lights stopped working on my violin. Did you change the battery? I didn't know it had batteries. What did you think was power? You know what? Just change the batteries. It's probably going to help. So for active violins, this is the thing you might want to know. For active violins, there's a switch inside the jack of that instrument that turns on the preamp. So when you plug it in, it powers up the preamp. You cannot leave an active violin plugged in all the time. You're going to drain the battery. So if you go to do sound check at 5 in the afternoon, and then you guys all go out to dinner, have a couple drinks, you come back to play at 11, and your violin's been sitting there plugged in for 6 hours, your battery might be dead. So I went to pick it up, and it was working during sound check. Yeah, but you left it plugged in for 6 hours, and the battery died. So speaking of power, here's another one for you. Make sure that phantom power is on if you need it. If you're using a DPA mic or you're using a paracoustic DI, it needs phantom power. And we could get into what that is, but you ask your sound guy. He'll know. There is a trap sometimes with phantom power. And that's one of the things with a DPA mic or an active microphone, that it needs power that comes from the board back through the mic cable. And you're like, I plug this thing in and it's plugged all in right, but it's not working. It's not making any sound. Make sure that the phantom power is on. You can ask your sound engineer for that, and he or she will turn that on. You go, oh, now it's working. There you go. There is a trap on phantom power. You'll notice in your XLR cables, your mic cables, there's 3 pins in that cable. A dynamic mic or a passive mic only needs 2 of those to be working. So you could plug in a 58 to that line, check, 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 yep, everything's working, and then you plug your DPA mic into that, and it's not working. And the engineer goes, yeah, well, I got the phantom power on. If there's a break in that 3rd line, then a passive mic is going to work on that line, but an active mic will not. So that is a thing that every now and then, like, you know what, let's change the cable anyway. I know it was working with a 58. Let's change the cable anyway. Oh, now it's working. It turns out that the 3rd line in that cable wasn't working, and it can be a little bit of a trap for you. And then another thing, Occam's razor, you guys have all heard of this. The simplest explanation is the most likely. My wife used to teach at a medical school, and they always tell when you've got a patient that comes in with a headache, don't go straight to brain cancer, right? It might be, but most likely you probably need a Tylenol or something. You know, maybe you had too much to drink last night, or you didn't have enough water today, or you're stressed out. The most common explanation is the most likely explanation. So we're going to start with the common stuff first. Don't think that maybe there's a solar flare that threw some kind of crazy stuff and that's why my system's humming. It might have been, but it's much more likely that you've got a ground loop somewhere. So horses, not zebras. Know your gear. You should be intimately familiar with how your pedal board is wired up because you should have wired it. And you should know how any given failure is going to present itself. So if it starts acting weird a certain way, you're like, oh, I bet I know what that is. Oh, can you tell I'm from the Midwest? All right, sorry. Real world examples. Let's talk about, I had this happen to me last week. Pedal board's on, violin's plugged in, no sound coming out of the speaker. Great, it's not working. What do I do? The first questions I ask myself, so I'm going to ask myself, it's not sending any signal from my pedal board. Really? And how do I know? So I'm going to check everything. Remember I said the violin's plugged in. Is it really? So I'm going to check that connection. How do I know? Well, because it won't go in anymore. So we're going to check every single thing. This should not take very long. We're just going to run a basic system check, right? Starting with the instrument, I'm going to check every connection. I'm going to unplug, replug, and I'm going to look at it to make sure that, yes, it's plugged in there, but is it seated all the way? That's a really common problem in here. People that aren't super experienced, they'll push it in and they'll feel it a little bit of resistance and they'll stop pushing in and you'll look and the thing's hanging out that much. It's not going to send a signal unless it's all the way in. So make sure everything's all the way seated. And then we're going to make all the connections. We're going to unplug and replug every cable on the pedal board. My simple pedal board has only got about a half a dozen. Shouldn't take but about 20 or 30 seconds. Unplug, replug. The power connection. Unplug, replug. Make sure that everything comes on. It's going to reboot my little HX stomp. All that's going to be good. And then I'll know, yes, everything is completely seated because this thing's been bouncing around in the back of a truck or a bus or whatever for the last how long. So just unplug and replug just to be sure, right? Make sure the volume knob on your violin's all the way up. Make sure the volume knob on your pedals are up. Make sure that your volume pedal is open. And that's what happened to me. I've been doing this a long time. This rig, I don't usually use a volume pedal, but for funsies, I plugged one in and I forgot that it was heel down. And I'm looking and I'm like, everything should be working. And then, oh, my volume pedal. Don't mind me. I'm good. The other thing, if you've got a pedal, a Helix, HX Stomp, a GT1000, an ME90, any of those pedals that has presets saved in it, and you turn it on and, oh, preset 3A, which is what it always comes up to, but there's no sound coming out. Change presets. Go to 3B, go to 4A, go to one of the other presets, and sometimes, boop, sound's coming out. You go, oh man, maybe that one preset had something, it got bumped when it was plugged in last time. I may have to monkey with that and get that thing fixed out. So all this should only take a couple of minutes. Now you've done all your due diligence on your end, and we can start figuring out if it's something past that that's the problem. So the next thing, I've got to think about where should my signal be going. And I've got a wire coming out of my pedal board that goes to a DI, that goes to a snake, that goes to the board. So start checking all of those things. One of the things, if you've got something on your pedal board that has a headphone output, plug your in-ears into that and you go, yeah, I'm playing the violin and I can hear it coming through my headphones. So I know that the problem is downstream of that, not upstream of that. And just keep checking each step. Bypass parts of the system if you can. I've got this whole pedal board sitting here, but what if I just plug my violin directly into the DI? I'm going to bypass my whole pedal board, and the sound engineer could be like, yes, now I can hear you. Well, we know now that the problem is between the violin and the DI, and that's narrowing it down. If I plug into the DI and the sound engineer can't still hear me, then, well, the problem could be anywhere, but that's, at least we're narrowing things down, right? So think that every step is a possible failure point. And you're like, oh my God, there's 1,000 steps. Not 1,000, maybe 50. And the thing is, you just reduce the possible failure modes to 50. And we can check 50 things. It may take us a few minutes, but we can check that. So at least it's not an infinite number of possibilities. It's a finite number, and we can deal with finite numbers. So make sure the violin is actually working. Plug it into your guitar player's rig. Yep, it's making sound. That means the instrument's working. Well, maybe the cable that runs from the violin to my pedal board isn't working. Let's plug that into something else and check it, or swap that cable out. And then we got to go through the, which of my pedals might be not working, any of my patch cables, any of my power connections. Sometimes DIs can go bad. Sometimes there's a switch on a DI that will turn it on and off. You go, oh no, I didn't know. Well, now you do. So switches, knobs, be flipping them, turning them. Make sure that each step along the way, you have studied that step and make sure that that thing is working. Remember, I think it's working. Do you know that it's working? And how do you know it's working? Maybe this DI's gone bad. We'll try it on something else. Plug it into somebody else's system and see if that DI is in fact working. So don't assume anything. Ask dumb questions. They're not dumb questions if you answer them and it fixed your thing, right? And actually, I really like it when it was a dumb thing that fixes my problem because it means it's cheap, right? Is it plugged in? Stand by. Yeah, I love when I forgot to plug something in because that's a cheap and easy fix. Doesn't cost me any money. Is it turned on? Yamaha violins have a switch on the back that you could have it plugged in. You'd be playing it all day. And if it's not turned on, it's not going to make any sound. Is it turned up? Sometimes you forget to turn the volume knob up. You're like, oh, I turned down before because I didn't want to bother anybody. And I forgot to turn it back up. And you're like, why isn't it making sound? All of these things have happened to me, by the way. Is it a dead battery? Do you have a bad cable? Are you plugged into the wrong channel? You say, well, I thought you said 15. He goes, no, I said 50. Oh, okay. Well, I was plugging into 15 and you were looking in 50 and that's why you couldn't hear me. Also, here is a bit of a frustrating thing. Multiple failures are possible. You could have a bad snake channel and a bad board channel. And so we changed snake channels and that didn't fix it. And, oh man, I guess the board channel could be bad too. And we switch it and we go, bing, it's working. You're like, oh my goodness, I would have never found that. You can if you don't trust anything, right? So you could have a bad cable and a bad channel. Complete failure to make sound is not the only problem that we can have on a gig, though. You might say, it sounded different at home than it sounds now. That doesn't necessarily mean something is wrong here. Check all your settings, all the stuff that we talked about, and all your connections, and then ask yourself, it sounds wrong. Are we sure it sounds wrong? Maybe you're just not used to hearing these types of speakers. And how do I know it sounds wrong? Well, I plugged my in-ears into the output of my pedal. It sounds nice and rich. And then what's coming out of the speakers sounds like this. Well, then something downstream of me is wrong. We can ask the engineer. We can say, well, was there somebody like a singer plugged into my channel last night? Oh, yeah, I had a wonky EQ because of the singer. Straighten it out. So always, again, just because something doesn't sound right doesn't mean there's necessarily a problem in this location. It could be somewhere else. Make sure that you know how you're hearing yourself and who has control over that besides you. One of the most common problems that we'll have on a gig is a buzz or a hum or a static or a noise. The first question you want to ask, is it only me? Is the violin channel the only one making that sound? If every other channel is making that sound, then it's probably not me, it's probably the system. Okay, then that gives, one, it means it's not my problem. And two, it means that we've got to go looking in that area. If it's just 2 or 3 of you, well, it's just those of us on this left side of the stage. Oh, are you guys all plugged into the same circuit? Because if you're plugged into the same circuit, it could be that that circuit has a ground issue. Check your connections. Make sure, again, plug and unplug everything. Maybe swap channels. Sometimes a bad channel in a snake can put a hum into something. Check your power. We were at the MW Rock Music Festival last summer, and we had an electric cellist who was 100% sure that his cello had a ground hum in it. And we ended up digging around and finding, my son was the one who found it. He's a tech. Found that one of the power cables, because there's a daisy chain of power cables all over the place because there's a bunch of electric players all over. One of the power cables, the ground pin had snapped off of that cable. So we swapped out that particular extension cable. Bloop, everything sounds great. So again, don't trust anything. Check everything. Check your cables, check your batteries, change the circuit. You know, if it's only those of you that are plugged into this one outlet, maybe it's that outlet. Maybe it's got dirty power in it. And then you can try flipping the ground lift on your DI. Sometimes that'll fix it. So I hope that gives you guys some strategies and some ideas for chasing down problems that you can encounter. Playing these electric instruments is a lot of fun. You make money. You make some really cool sounds with it. If things aren't working right, they can be very, very, very frustrating. But if you do this enough, you will start to notice patterns and you will start to develop strategies for chasing these things down. And I hope this kind of gives you a good starting point. As always, mash that subscribe button and check out these other videos that we've got on our channel. And I hope to see you guys very soon. Peace.